Hello, this is a video for Professor Zaldivar's Intro to Philosophy course. Today we are discussing St. Anselm's version of the ontological argument. There are actually several versions of the ontological argument, but the most famous and one of the earliest was put forward by a Catholic thinker, St. Anselm. St. Anselm was a Benedictine monk who was alive during the 11th and 12th century. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1093 until his death, and this is almost 300 years before Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. One thing that I like to point out about St. Anselm is that his motto was Fides quaerens intellectum, which means something like faith following reason, or faith pursuing reason. St. Anselm happened to believe very strongly that all the truths of religion are compatible with all the truths of rational thinking. And so we could never be led astray. The two could never, if we did a good job of considering both, the two could never disagree. His argument, or the ontological argument as presented by St. Anselm, starts with the idea, or with the question, can you think of a being than which none greater can be conceived? A being that is so magnificent that it is the greatest possible being. The solution, the quick answer to that question is that St. Anselm presents is that yes, we can. And it does seem indeed that we can conceive of a being that is the greatest possible. Once we've done that, we get the following argument. We can conceive of a thing which is the greatest possible thing. Existing in reality is better than existing in our minds, so the greatest possible thing must exist in reality. Therefore, God exists. It's a pretty straightforward argument. Here's another version of it. Here's the same logic applied to money. Can you conceive of $1,000? Is it better to have $1,000 in your mind or in your hand? A real $1,000 in your hand. Obviously, it's better to have a real $1,000 in your hand than one in your mind. Obviously, it is better for a thing to exist than to be imaginary. And if God is the greatest possible thing, then it is better for him to exist than to be imaginary. And so he must exist. There's a kind of bonus argument here, which is to say that the greatest possible, if it's truly the greatest possible thing, then we must be unable to imagine that it doesn't exist. So if you think about two candidates for the title of greatest possible being, one of which we could imagine not existing, one of which we could not imagine not existing, which one of those would be greater? Logic seems to suggest that it's the one that we could not imagine not existing. And so the greatest possible being not only exists because it's greater to exist than not exist, but it also exists necessarily because it's impossible to not think of them as existing. Or in other words, it's impossible to think of them as not existing. This is a pretty tidy little argument, and it seems to do a pretty good job of showing that God exists. However, a contemporary of St. Anselm, by the name of Ganilo, has a particular response. He argues that if we accept this argument, then it's possible to prove that something called the greatest possible island also exists. After all, you say, is the greatest possible island better if it exists or better if it's imaginary? And then you would respond following St. Anselm's logic, well, it's better if it exists. And so Ganilo says, well then, since it's the best possible island, it must exist. And you can imagine this for for lots of stuff, right? The greatest possible tank, and the greatest possible Snickers bar, the greatest possible hat, etc., etc. This, of course, is a ridiculous situation, and it suggests that there's something wrong with the argument. But St. Anselm has a response. He says, look, the problem with thinking about the greatest possible island is that islands are composed of properties like shape and weight and size. And you can't have the greatest possible size. You can't have the greatest possible shape. What is the greatest possible shape? Square, triangle, circle? No one knows. There's no way to compare shapes in terms of greatness. There's no way to compare size in terms of greatness, etc. You can't compare colors in terms of greatness, for example. However, properties like power and knowledge can be conceived as great as possible, right? It is possible to say the most powerful thing that can be, right? You simply say it's more powerful than anything else. It is possible to say the smartest or the most knowledgeable thing that can be. You simply say the thing that knows more than anything else, or that knows everything which can be known. So while it does not make sense to think of the perfect island, the reasons that it does not make sense to think of the perfect island won't work on God, because he has the right kind of properties. He has the sorts of properties that can be conceived of as great as possible. I want you to notice something though. I just a little bit earlier said that you can't think of the greatest possible color or the greatest possible hairstyle, which means that God, or the greatest possible size, or the greatest possible weight, the greatest possible height, for example, all of this means that God does not have a body, right? Because if God had a body, then there would have to be something like the greatest possible skin tone, and the greatest possible shape of your nose, and the greatest possible ratio of the length of your index finger to your ring finger. And all of these things are weird to think about, but also unlikely to have a greatest possible designation. And so St. Anselm not only proves that God exists as the greatest possible being, but also proves that the greatest possible being would not have a body. Kind of an interesting conclusion. Of course, the main conclusion that St. Anselm wants you to accept is that God exists, right? Following the reasoning that we've been using so far. I do want to make one more thing. When St. Anselm says something is great, he doesn't mean simply that it has the largest magnitude or the largest amount, right? For him, it's more of a description of a kind of quality. It's almost like saying the greatest positive amount, the greatest good amount. And positive and good here means something like, well, positive or good or beneficial or worth having, right? So there's the greatest amount of power worth having is sort of what he's getting at, not just the largest number of a particular thing. Thanks very much for listening to this installment of Professor Zaldivar's brief video lectures.